Okay. Okay, so it looks like we have people still coming in, but just to kind of kick us off, welcome to the We Need to Talk About OER Discovery panel. And I just wanted to kind of give some background of how this panel came to be. Sorry, my cat is like, it's feeding time right now, so she might be making loud eating noises. But so I've been working on a project to kind of look at the landscape of OER discovery with Spark. And I thought it would be really great to have a panel of leaders out there in OER who are OER advocates who are working on discovery, just kind of talk about the state of things. I think that there's a lot to discuss and a lot of work that has been done and progress and new initiatives that are happening now. So I'll just kind of start everyone off introducing everyone who's on the panel. So I'm Camille Thomas. I'm a scholarly communication librarian at Florida State University. And like I said, I've worked on a few projects with Spark, the Scholarly Academic Resources Coalition, or Scholarly Publishing Academic Resources Coalition. I always miss something when I have to say the whole acronym. But yeah, and I'll kind of be taking us through the questions. We will have some additional time for questions at the end. Like we were planning to have a good discussion and leave lots of time for that. Michelle.
Thanks, Camille. So my name is Michelle Brennan. I am the Information Services Manager at ISKME, the Institute for Study of Knowledge Management and Education. Also our flagship OER Commons. And we work with several departments of education in K-12, as well as several consortia working on OER in the higher education space. And so a lot of what I'll talk about today is from experience working with and learnings around research from working with our OER affordable learning initiative folks across the country. I will pass it to Wally.
Okay. Yeah, my name is Wally Groteforst. I'm Associate University Librarian at George Mason University in Fairfax, Virginia. And I think the reason I'm on this panel is because I created the OER Meta Finder, which is pretty much the contours of my knowledge around OERs. I'm not really an OER person, but I did get onto that project because the group that handles OERs in our university reports to me. So that's how I got pulled into this.
Alrighty. Hi, everyone. I'm Karen Lauritsen. I am Publishing Director at the Open Education Network. The OEN is a community of people, primarily librarians, but also instructional designers, administrators, and others who support one another in developing open ed programs. We design and share systems, resources, and best practices so that nobody has to go it alone. A little bit about my role. I support open textbook development from planning publication through production to completion, and hopefully inclusion in the open textbook library. Many of you are familiar with the OTL. It is a resource for the common good. It now includes more than 800 open textbooks, around 70% of which have been reviewed by faculty at member institutions. And just for fun fact, August is the OTL's busiest month in any year. And in this most recent year, 2020, we had 27,000 visits in our busiest day. So back to you, Camille.
Okay. Yeah, and someone asked in the chat if we would have a link to the slides, and I can post a link kind of towards the end. I also didn't clarify my role. So I do work at Florida State University, and in my role as scholarly communication librarian, sorry, my cat wants attention. I work on open access for research initiatives and also our open education initiatives. And then when I worked with Spark on a couple projects, but particularly on looking at OER discovery most recently. But to get us to the first question, which is, what even is OER discovery? What are we talking about? What do we mean when we say OER discovery? We jotted down some kind of collaboratively, some kind of responses, which and if any of you have anything to add that I missed, feel free to jump in. But so it's, how do you find what you need for materials, for classes, or for other structures of learning? Where do you look, and what are you trying to find exactly? And then metadata, so how we describe OER so it is findable, and then evaluating the quality and fit of the material for learning purposes. So, selecting the content and usable content at that. And this kind of, the way that we were defining it mirrors kind of some of the information retrieval structure that I was looking for, but I still can't find exactly the framework I was thinking of. So yeah, does anybody else have anything to add on that?
Sounds good, Camille. Thank you.
Okay. So this is the set of questions that we'll be answering today. So now that we kind of have a base of what we're talking about, what do we mean when we talk about OER discovery? How would you describe the current state of OER discovery? And I think we're starting with Michelle.
Yeah. So based on what we hear from our partners who are working with faculty and library staff in the field, so specifically, around the higher ed context is probably a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today, is that folks are looking to grow their OER collections and repositories for their specific institutions. So either for their specific campus or the consortia that we're working with, working to grow OER collections at a consortial level, sort of at a shared services level. And what we are hearing is that the work that Karen and her team has done over at the Open Textbook Library has really contributed to mainstreaming and making OER textbooks findable and adoptable. And that folks are now sort of transitioning towards wanting to build full courses around central texts like OER, the Open Textbook Library content, and that finding or creating supplemental material or more modular materials is really where the challenge is and where folks are trying to grow their collections.
I think I'm next. I've had to shut off my video because it says my internet connection is unstable. But let me start by saying that 6 or 7 years ago, surveys showed that simply finding OER content was the biggest barrier to adoption. And for a few years after that, you could count on seeing some mention of difficulty finding OERs in every article or report. But I think today, in the last couple of years, especially if you stay away from commercial publishers' brochures, you rarely see issues around OER discovery getting those 30-point headlines. But I think what you do still see is that here 3 years after we launched the Meta Finder, for example, it's still true that while people don't talk much about simple discovery anymore, we're all thinking more about the need for more efficient discovery. And by more efficient, I mean getting a higher signal to noise ratio in retrieval, less duplication of content in the search results, unambiguous usage rights in every item we retrieve, and a way to quickly assess the pedagogical fit of an item. If we had those last two bits, the usage rights and the pedagogical fit, we could easily, or we could better slice and dice the result sets with facets. If we ignore for a minute the traditional method, which is where a searcher dives in and out of different silos, there's two approaches to solving that discovery problem across multiple providers. You can use a just-in-case system like Merlot or SUNY's Oasis. That just-in-case tag comes from supply chain management, wherein you store a lot of inventory just in case somebody needs it. Here, the inventory is metadata that's harvested from the various OER sites. And that metadata is normalized to some degree and indexed, and it's that index that you search. The results are limited to the items that that search system knows about. The other approach that we take with the MetaFinder is called a just-in-time system. The just-in-time, drawing back to that analogy with supply chain, is that we don't have any stock. We just rely on prompt delivery from suppliers. And in this case, that's the OER content silos. So instead of searching a pre-built index, when you hit submit on the MetaFinder, it launches up to 21 real-time searches across up to 21 sites that you've asked it to search. It then collects, dedupes, and ranks the top 100 results from each of those sites and combines all that into a single faceted results set. For now, I'll conclude by pointing out that those two approaches have advantages and disadvantages. And as you might expect, each poses a dramatically different maintenance requirement. And in our particular case, to help bridge the gap between those approaches, we include metadata aggregators like Merlot and Oasis, as well as content providers as search targets in the MetaFinder.
Yeah, I would say that there's still kind of a wild west of discovery. Like a lot of people are doing really great work, and I think that I think there's a structure, like a scaffolding there for structure, but I think there are still a lot of silos. And I still think I think discovery is a big sticking point. I do agree that you know, things pull up. It's not so much that when you look, there's nothing to find. But yeah, that kind of does it fit, that part of it, and it being more robust is kind of where we're at this point. So just kind of moving us to the second question, which I think has come up a bit, but what are the main challenges and needs you see for OER discovery? So I guess like the maybe top one or two.
Camille, could I interrupt and just jump in for a second? Because I think with number one, I would just like to add that I bet most people on this call might be able to describe the current state of OER discovery in a word or less. It might be kind of fun to see what the participants have to say in the chat. Just to add on to what Michelle and Wally commented on the higher ed landscape. I also want to say that it's really exciting, the different things that people are working on and improvements they're trying to make with OER discovery. I think the input of the community is really important, and that's where we're always aiming to be in the OTL, is responding to the community. And I also think that we all imagine a world sometimes where a tool will do all the things for us. And certainly the tools can be improved, but it's hard for me to imagine a tool that can replace the human element of a librarian or a faculty member doing the analysis and looking at a resource and figuring out, is this right for the course? You know, is this what my students need? And that's part of what I really appreciate about LibOER and the OEN listservs, is that that work is done a lot of times literally in the community. Hey, I've tried these search engines. Hey, I've looked here, but I can't find anything. Now I'm turning to people to help me find something. So in some ways, I think that's one of the most exciting spaces in OER discovery, even if it's not totally scalable. I just wanted to acknowledge the work that people in this call do to help one another in that process. And it's really fun to see your words in the chat.
Yeah,
Yeah, those are great ones.
No, I think that's a great idea. Yeah, I'm seeing like frustrating, overwhelmed. I saw like library centric, like decentralized, vague, incomplete. Yeah, so this is some really great, good to know.
Yeah, and I would sort of like going into the next second question and a little bit into the third, definitely agree with what Karen has said about the value of librarians and faculty doing the evaluation work. I think where we are focused currently is how do we make that evaluation work easier for librarians and faculty. So we're currently working on sort of a national research project where we are going to faculty and librarians in several consortia and trying to determine, when you look for OER, what do you need to know in order to make those decisions? And then from those learnings, how can we make that faster for you, more efficient for you? And I would definitely say there is a huge need or emphasis that we're hearing from folks on that social aspect. Like the most important things, some of the most important things to folks are, you know, who else has used it? Do I trust them? What sort of reviews are there? So I think there is this really strong tradition, especially in higher ed, of peer review, right? Like that's what you expect. And you know, in traditional publishing, you have a way to know that that has happened, the outcomes are. So trying to systematically build that into OER, I think is going to be a really effective way to sort of make it a little bit easier to assess quality and fit. And some of that, we don't necessarily have room for that type of metadata tagging everywhere currently. And so I think sussing out what those most important things are and having an agreement on that type of metadata to support will be important. But also, yes, the fact that it's decentralized and you get a lot of duplication, being able to tell the difference between duplicates and versions, that is something we're also looking at, because that is quite challenging when you have it in several different kinds of formats with maybe some small changes or adaptations.
I second that difficulty.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, most sites have at best 3 common data elements: metadata elements, author, title, and publication date. But across repositories, you'll even see those drift on the same publication. Different word in the title, or an additional thing that makes it really hard to have a computer figure out how it unravels the duplication or selects the appropriate copy.
So someone asked in the chat what Michelle meant by MD tagging, which I think is metadata tagging. So I guess we could, because we are kind of getting into like detail. So for those who are not well versed in that, can we like expand on that?
Sure, I can expand a little bit on that. So the types of metadata tagging that you might be most familiar with are things like keywords, knowing what sort of format or file type a piece of content is. But other types of metadata, like more social metadata, would consist of things like resource reviews, information about who reviewed the resource or used the resource, learning objectives. So not necessarily just topical tags, but what will students learn if they, or what are students supposed to learn using this module or this activity or this chapter, for example.
Thank you. Anything else to add to that, or are we ready to kind of move to, I know we're kind of like between questions 2 and 3, so maybe let's like move to 3 and talk about what approaches you think would best address these needs and challenges.
So I know I'm supposed to go first on our list, but I feel like I've just spent a lot of time talking. So I want to open the floor to Karen and Wally.
Well, I can say from my vantage point, which is trying to offer a search engine that increases search efficiency, the key to fixing most of these issues is standardizing on a particular metadata scheme for OER content, and then devoting some time to enriching that descriptive metadata. If I could just issue a decree, it would be that the community settle on some schema that suits at least the basic needs of all the interested parties. And by that, I mean what we often see in the library world anyway, is an impulse to over-engineer the standard or the solution before we deploy it. But I think we should go the other way, focus on a minimum that improves the current state of affairs, but offers a design that can evolve and improve as we work with it. Because in most things, the simplicity will speed the adoption of it. And then I'd give preference to repositories and content providers that utilize that schema, so that we're always talking about the same thing on every site.
And I would add trying to address the challenges that are being shared in the chat. So acknowledging that listservs are sometimes limited to certain organizations or groups and very difficult to archive, and that labor is unpaid. And then thinking about a varied way of offering OTL metadata, at least. So we try to respond. So for example, on a listserv recently, there was an inquiry about how many books in a particular subject area are in the OTL, breaking down by subject. And while that information was kind of findable in the OTL, it was not easily discoverable. So we added a column of that information to our CSV data. We also worked a long time this year with OCLC on getting our MARC records in tip-top shape to include them there. And then we also have a JSON API that's available. So acknowledging that there's a lot, I think always going to be a lot of different pathways, a lot of different preferred methodologies depending on who the user is. And so trying to be as accommodating as possible, while at the same time coming up with some sort of shared metadata. I'm looking now through the chat because I think it was Heather who said it so well. But a shared schema, which of course I think starts with the very beginning when we're starting to work on publication. And so that'll probably come up again a little bit later in our discussion.
Yeah, that is something that, and that's one of my big answer for approaches is kind of collaborative effort and connecting those materials and things like that. And that's actually something that was a part of the initiative that I worked on with Spark with Heather. Heather was part of the working group. And we presented earlier on the work that we did to have that, to have kind of a Rosetta Stone of shared core elements, and Michelle as well. And it was a collaborative effort. And so, but we're looking to open that up into kind of a wider thing. And I think, yeah, I think looking at connecting it with like JSON, and I think to Wally's point, I think there is a certain, I think we can have a balance. Like, I don't think we have to make those interests compete of like having it be straightforward and work well, you know, with a lot of how the web works, and having it have a lot more robust aspects and things that really reflect and support, you know, really robust discovery of OER and that sort of evaluation learning objectives and that level of detail that is needed.
Yeah, and I would just add to that while there is a need to have sort of a standardized core, I think, of metadata, we also recognize that there will also always be extensions or differences. And I don't really know that we will ever be able to have full agreement, especially around like different vocabulary needs, different ways of tagging. And so I think a lot of what we've tried to focus on is accommodating a sort of a core schema. So I think that the Rosetta Stone that we've been working on with Camille leading that, and the rest of the working group at Spark, has been really great because it's collaborative. So it allows us to sort of get at what are those really core needs that we can really serve most broadly, but then also how do we build on necessary extensions for stuff that folks want to have beyond that core, right? Because we think there's always going to be that need. And then how do we also build translation services to translate between different tagging or schema vocabularies? So I don't necessarily think that 100% standardization will be realistic, but designing sort of a core standard that we can sort of extend or translate to will be really effective. Cable asked, oh no, I see, Heather answered. LRMI and our Rosetta Stone, yes, it featured prominently.
Any other thoughts on approaches? Yes, thanks, Heather. I was like, it's helpful because I'm like, I feel like I would be just repeating, and it's a lot easier to just show people. So yeah, it looks like we can move on to 4 with what, if any, success stories do you know of when it comes to discovery? So this can include your institution or your organization's initiatives. It can also include like successful end user discovery of OER. I think this would be a good one to open up for people to answer in the chat too, if they have any examples. And it's totally valid for the panelists to not have any examples.
I can offer a couple of examples. So we are really focusing right now on, OER Commons works with multiple organizations, as I said before, to sort of create their own OER libraries. And we sort of realized that while there are good reasons for different organizations wanting to sort of have their own thing, so they're, a silo, there's also this desire to share between one another. And what we're trying to do is devise ways of making that sharing most or more efficient. And so there are some small steps forward in sort of some of these beta projects that we're doing, where folks are sharing actually across consortia. So we are currently, for example, working with Viva, the Virginia Library Consortia, and they have been doing some work to have their librarian and faculty assess course content that was aligned to courses by faculty and librarians in Louisiana and in Ohio. And we've had a really successful process of being able to sort of seed their OER course alignment project from content that has already been created and evaluated and vetted by other consortia. So it doesn't necessarily work perfectly. Not everything passes faculty evaluation because there are some differences, obviously. But it's actually been really wonderful to sort of see that process evolve and sort of be able to sort of expand it across different consortia and see it improve and iterate on it. And how do we make this work? What do we need? So I've really been enjoying that.
I have a story of a small success story. I guess it's about the worldwide reach of OERs and the interconnectedness of the world. And last month, I went back and looked the other day, and from last month, the top 25 sites, we tracked who sends traffic to the MetaFinder. And in the top 25 were sites from South Africa, Australia, Kenya, Taiwan, Canada, and the Netherlands, and the rest of the US. But I was surprised to see that all over the world, people are coming in to try and find OER material.
Yep.
Yeah, I've been trying to listen to my colleagues and read my colleagues' comments in the chat, because I think there's also some great examples in the chat. And earlier in our call, when we were looking at the first question and describing the current state of OER discovery, somebody in the chat said, it's geared towards librarians. And this is something that we try to always keep top of mind in the OTL, working so closely with librarians, but really wanting the OTL to be sort of a faculty first resource, and thinking about how faculty search for materials, how they want, as Michelle described, to know, who else is using this book, who else has looked at it, and what did they think of it. And so we're constantly trying to balance those two key needs. And I mentioned earlier, we worked a lot with OCLC. We, including Andy Saroff, who's a developer at the University of Minnesota, who works on the OEN team. And it was a lot to sort of retroactively get the OTL metadata into shape for the OCLC. And I think it was a success to do that so that it can benefit the work librarians are doing on their campus and get things in the catalog, but it doesn't necessarily add to or take away from the faculty experience in the OTL. And then there's been other success stories mentioned already with Heather White and Holly Wheeler and the Mason MetaFinder. And then I will just say again, I think it's a success every time somebody comments on a listserv and connects somebody to a resource they were looking for. I see it every week where somebody, expresses their thanks. Maybe it's just what they were looking for. So I still really think that those count as discovery success stories.
Yeah, I think those are great points. I had kind of a specific example from my institution of just someone, it was people founded, they wanted to translate it into Chinese, and then there was like another related textbook. So that in some of the work that we've been doing for the Rosetta Stone, that was something that I thought was interesting, where it was like, yeah, like here's this related material, and he wanted us to show that they were in relationship to each other. But I think that kind of end user thing can be really helpful. I think there's definitely a lot of success stories. I really like that Karen pointed out that listserv kind of that sort of help with discovery also is a success. I agree with that, and I think that looking at the faculty, how faculty are discovering it too. I know last year at Open Ed, there was a session that the Bayview analytics people did, and they showed that like most instructors are like 32% of them find it on their own. I'm not sure what that means exactly, but like that can mean a lot of things. 20%, they find out from a colleague what materials they want to use, and then 19% found out from libraries and other organizations like that. I think I hear some background noise somewhere. But yeah, so just kind of thinking about that and having a good like approach with thinking about end users. Yeah, someone sounds upset. That's how my cat sounded earlier before I fed her, before we got started. And yeah, so I think that that's a really good point, like thinking about discovery from lots of different angles and lots of different access points. And what could be seemingly small, but in fact could be successes. I still think, I think Jeff wrote in the chat somewhere too, though, that there's a lot of instructors are, yeah, when we look at that kind of data, it's like, what does finding it yourself mean? There's also, I think, a small percentage of people who identify that they found out through the publisher, but I wonder what, I think there's a lot of in like the way that commercial materials are marketed, it's sort of, I think, as Jeff said in the chat earlier, like it's very presented to you and it's not this like query that people are making all the time. So I just thought that was interesting. I thought I would share. And so it looks like we can move on to question 5. So how do we reduce the effect of silos in OER? Because all these successes are happening, but like, how do we connect more?
So I definitely think, as we've stressed a few times, the shared sort of having a shared idea of, the metadata schema. So what the information looks like that you can pass back and forth between different OER repositories or different discovery services, for example. And I also think providing sort of more interoperable services that all of our platforms can use technically on the back end will also be really helpful, because I think sort of the last specification I think that we've had that's widely implemented was OEI harvesting. And I think there's just so much in that specification that doesn't really meet the needs of where we are today. So I think developing more open APIs probably be really helpful. That is something that OER Commons and ISKME is working on. I know I had actually looked at the OTL, OTN JSON API recently, and I am super excited about that as well, and look forward to being able to integrate with that. And I also know we're working with a lot of our partners to pull in external collections that they want to have in their repositories, and looking at how we can support that best. So definitely looking at a lot of OEI harvesting and a couple of other things. So definitely just trying to reduce the technical barriers so that faculty and librarians can really focus on the teaching and learning aspects.
Yes, I agree with that. I think if we had a more standardized way of surfacing the content in each silo, then the number of them becomes a computer problem instead of a burden to searchers. But in the absence of that, it's every additional silo makes a discovery a more difficult problem. So I think we're at something of a fork in the road on this. We either have to think about how we reduce the number of places you have to look, or we have to think about how we build some sort of virtual OER database out of the many siloed repositories.
Yeah, someone in Jody in the chat mentioned having more like aggregates and or aggregators and people who were publishing OER pushing to those and just having more tools like that. I know, of course, there are federated searches. I'm really excited as well about um, the use of APIs and having more like interoperability. I think that's a way forward. I also think like opening it up for, in a collaborative sense, like opening it up for more contribution or like lots of access points for people to contribute. Just because like working on the Rosetta Stone, we pulled in a lot of like metadata people who were working at their institutions. And I don't know that we always have those conversations with people across the libraries in that way. And I think that there's a lot of people who could contribute, or yeah, when things are published, like a lot of the time, at least in like where I am, we're a small department and we're not always, you know, necessarily consulting with the metadata and cataloging people. We do quite a bit, but like I think a lot of places are doing what they can. And I think if we had more kind of collaboration, it would add to kind of that robustness, and there'd be a lot more conversations about making things interoperable from the beginning of the process. Okay, it looks like we can move on to the last question, and this is kind of switching topics a bit, but what are some considerations for accessibility, diversity, inclusion, and equity we can make for OER discovery? How do we standardize metadata in a flexible way, like Michelle said, for OER in a way that prioritizes inclusion?
Okay, so I can speak a little bit to some ongoing projects and research at ISKME. And I think a lot of where we're grounding OER discovery and description is really in trying to look at OER authoring and the need for universal design. So through the lens of UDL, both, you know, what you think of as traditional accessibility, like WCAG compliance, for example, but also sort of cultural accessibility, so cultural relevance, making sure that everyone in the classroom can feel represented and engaged in the content that you're teaching, and sort of working backwards from what is needed in the design of content and what teachers and students need. So how do you need to design your materials? What do you need in them? And working backwards to, okay, so if that's what you need, how do we make it easy for you to find the content that has been created and includes those things? And it can be really thorny because like with some of the more technical aspects of accessibility, for example, understanding how to explain that to folks, like what is a screen reader? What does it mean that it has alternative text? What good does that do my students, right? As well as looking at issues of DEI is sort of the same thing. Like if I am trying to have a culturally responsive classroom, what sort of considerations do I need to have, and how does that affect my students and their learning? And that, I think, is definitely a little bit more nascent in its sort of development in talking about this from a metadata perspective. But we have looked at things like, you know, we know that there's a conversation around the Library of Congress headings, for example, of needing to overhaul those because they're not great, culturally speaking. And we've also looked at a couple of other organizations who are doing work around this. One of them I'll give a shout out to is the Diverse Book Finder. because that is definitely a taxonomy that we've looked at and considered for having more DEI focused search and discovery and tagging. So I'll pass it to other folks if they want to talk about it.
Yeah, I'll just kind of add, and I think we have to wrap up soon, so we have as much time for questions as we hoped. But yeah, I'll kind of add that I think there's a lot of conscious editing and like inclusive metadata conversations going on, and I think that that would be really good to look at. I think that in talking about the ways that OER has a lot of potential, there's a lot of opportunity to do things kind of differently, and take the benefits of you know how robust a lot of library discovery practices are and library metadata, but be really intentional in taking the kind of like, because things are nascent, and we can like use APIs, and certainly like newer kind of technology side of doing things is not excluded from having practices that are have the same kind of like structures that we need to look at. But I think that there's an opportunity to not just have to replicate things. Like I think we can do something a little bit more flexible, and that builds these kind of considerations into like the workflow and normalizing thinking about accessibility and inclusion. And I know these are, like I said, I think a lot of people who are publishing OER are trying to make as many considerations as they can. But I think that I think it could be integrated in a way that's, it becomes really normalized, and it's not this thing we have to think about or be like, oh, or haven't thought about, and just kind of going and replicating the things that we have problems with today in terms of standardization. So yeah, okay. Unless anyone has anything else to add, I kind of want to move on to questions. I've seen a lot of questions. I've been trying to keep track of them, but there were quite a few. We had problem questions for you all, but I think there are some questions in there.
As we sift through the chat to try and find them, I just want to really echo what you both said and how important I think it is to think about these issues at the very beginning with the publishing process, much like we talk about doing that with accessibility. You don't want it to be like something at the very end. Oh, how do we mark this checklist or kind of do these little things at the very end? It's integrating diversity, equity, inclusion, representation, an accessible representative experience into the publishing process. And I think probably engaging students and faculty in thinking about, especially someone mentioned, metadata at the chapter level. I think that's a great opportunity. If you want people to discover this, if you want it to be applicable in diverse contexts, like let's think about this at a very chapter level in terms of what content are you including? How is it representative? And then later down the line, that'll show up in the metadata. So just wanted to second that emotion as we look for questions.
I did see a question about, is there some sort of marketing guide with these resources for instructors? I'll say I've seen that information on a lot of different like library guides, and if people have programs to engage instructors, I've seen that there. I don't know if there's like one kind of seminal guide. What do you all think?
I think I've seen lots of accessibility guides. I don't know if we're talking about authoring guides in general. I've seen lots of accessibility and UDL guides. But I think I see a lot of folks struggling with those because there's so much in them. They're so complicated. And again, that might be an area where we just sort of need to come to a consensus as a community about what's most important.
I interpreted that as like for the discovery resources we were talking about, but it may have been about accessibility. I also saw a question about web-based OER, and probably we can extend that to ancillaries as well, because I know that's a common question. Like, how is discovery going for that, or are they included in some of these like major places to find things?
I remember seeing that question too, and while the OTL does have a lot of EPUB and PDFs because we require a single portable format, I think still the majority of the resources do have a web version. It's just that we won't include it unless it also has the portable version. So when it comes to OTL, that is there. And then we're also working, Student Assistant is painstakingly going record by record to try and locate ancillary materials for the books that are in the OTL and then adding links to those materials. So trying to sort of break that silo down. And that's thanks to OER Commons and many repositories at institutions across the country that have some of those ancillaries posted as well. So that's the OTL scoop.
I saw another question about how can we support that human discovery element, or how is it supported, I guess? Meaning like the listservs and that kind of thing.
I'm not sure if that person's interested in like sustainability models or how we as a community, kind of share the load and tackle these questions of labor. So feel free, if you ask that question, to clarify in the chat. But I think it's part of the OEN and other open ed models is looking for the answers within the community rather than external vendors, trying to find a balance in our current work environment to do that in a way that is sustainable at the individual level and the collective level. But I think a lot of organizations are doing a pretty good job in bringing people together, encouraging them to share resources, and it comes so naturally in the librarian community.
Yeah, I would definitely echo that, in that even in the work that we do with our platform, when we're talking about curation projects, curation services, we are often connecting people before we're deciding on content. And so we encourage, we connect, our clients with other clients who are doing similar work. We highlight collections or make recommendations based on, like, has someone else done this, and can we find good examples of content that you can leverage from, either people that have paid services, or we actually have a list of folks who do great work that we highlight that just use like a free group feature. So we're always on the lookout to connect the people, right? And that's kind of where our focus is.
I see another question a couple people have about if there are any plans to integrate with learning management systems like Canvas Commons. And then someone else asked about like integrating more with, I guess, Google indexing, because they were asking about like the Creative Commons filter when searching. So I guess any plans to integrate with those two types of things?
So I will just say that we do have integrations with all of the learning management systems currently. And I know that we get, we have folks that are paid clients, but we also do have free services for folks who are just interested in OER. and want to include OER collections for their schools or really just even for teachers in their classrooms. So we do offer those integrations. And as far as Google, I know that we are pretty intentional about making sure all of our content is marked up well so that it returns in Google search results.
Okay. I think someone else also asked about finding underrepresented or materials by underrepresented authors or materials like that have more marginalized people. Sorry, yeah, where can we find text for underrepresented students? I see a lot of that connection happening like on the person-to-person level, like on listservs and things like that. I know some people are sharing that work that BC Campus has done with Indigenous populations. And so I forget who made the point, but there's also a lot of work that needs to be done in terms of authoring things that feature that perspective. That's another big opportunity with OER that is still really nascent. So hopefully that answers the question.